Great. So we recently concluded a poll of 34 countries, and one of the things we wanted to understand was how people across these countries feel about China. In general, we find attitudes are quite mixed. So we have a global median of 40% who are favorable towards China and 41% who are unfavorable. But this kind of obfuscates a lot of the differences that we see across region and across country. So it ranges from a high of 71% in Russia down to a low of 14% in Japan. And in general, in countries that have higher GDPs per capita, that tend to be scored as more democratic by Freedom House or as less corrupt by Transparency International, they tend to have lower favorability towards China. The US is one of the particularly negative countries where only around a quarter of people have a favorable view of China, and the same is largely true in Canada. Where we tend to see slightly higher favorability ratings are in some of the sub-Saharan African countries that we studied, as well as in Latin America. One of the questions that we've been tracking over time is which country people tend to see as the leading economic power. So we asked them a forced choice question of whether or not they think that the leading economic power is the US, China, Japan, or the countries of the European Union. In general, we see that in many countries, more people tend to say that the US is the leading economic power than say the same of China. This is something that we've seen for a handful of years. In general, though, there's quite a bit of variation across regions. And one of the things that we see is that when people tend to say that the US is the strongest economic power, they're also more likely to say that if they're forced to choose, that they prefer to have closer economic ties with the US than with China. In some of the countries that we studied, we also asked people whether or not they believe that the United States, as well as China, have a great deal of influence on their economies or no influence at all. On balance, we tended to see that more people said that the US had a great deal or a fair amount of influence on their countries than said the same of China. But among the people who said that either of these countries had influence, we asked a follow-up question about whether or not that influence was positive or negative. And in some countries, and particularly in some of the developing countries that we surveyed, we tended to see that more people actually felt that China's influence was positive, even if they felt that the United States had more influence.